Hello and good evening, good morning to everyone. The deadline for financial services firms to comply with the new consumer duty regulations is fast approaching. The rules will require most firms to make fundamental and wide-ranging changes to the way they do business, from product governance through to pricing, consumer support. So, how are customers, how are firms approaching this, and what are some of the opportunities to be explored while ensuring compliance? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Nick from Delta Capita, Simon from Saxo Markets UK, and Joseph from Aveni. We'll begin with introductions before we get into the questions. I'm Vinita Ramtree. I am the CEO for the APAC business at Delta Capita, previously also the head of conduct at Barclays Wealth in the UK. Delta Capita, as some of you do know, is a leading global managed services and technology solutions and consulting provider. Over to you, Simon, for introductions.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Simon O'Malley. I'm CFO at Saxo. We're a multi-asset trading platform with Danish heritage and a high degree of technology. We serve retail investors, traders, and institutions globally.
I'm Joseph Twigg, CEO of Aveni, and for those of you that don't know us, we are a technology firm specialising in natural language processing, specifically looking at how NLP AI automation helps scale and automate assurance processes and compliance monitoring.
Yeah, and hi everyone. I'm Nick Wilcock. I'm a managing principal at Delta Capita. So I advise clients in all areas of non-financial risk and regulatory initiatives.
Great, thank you. So with that note, a lot of times when we've heard about conduct or we've heard about treating consumers fairly or even with consumer duty, a lot of the conversation is about the role of leadership and the tone from the top. So Nick, what in here is the role of the board?
So if we step back a bit, consumer duty really is, in the view of the regulator, it's a generational change really in the treatment of consumers by firms, and they really want to see a strong lead from both the board, business management, and also a strong tie into the senior management regime. It's definitely the FCA's top priority for this year. Firms, if they're manufacturers, they're 2 months away from implementation, 4 months if you're a distributor. And the thinking and the leadership needs to be quite advanced at this stage of the actual initiative. The boards need to be engaged, not just in terms of signing off the implementation plan, that was needed to be done last year in October, but in sort of ongoing support of the actual initiative. The role of the board champion is critical. They're the person needs to be appointed to bridge the gap between the board, if there is one, and the business and the team that are implementing the initiative. And also the senior manager needs to be appointed at an early stage. Early on, firms were really looking to compliance to lead this, and that's not really the case. It needs to be driven by the business with strong input from the board. Ways in which the board can be engaged, and the FCA, as I think people know, produced their implementation review a few weeks ago. And a self-assessment should be worked on and presented to the board. And really, when we're talking about staff communication and awareness, the board should be helping to drive that and provide that backdrop in terms of the importance of consumer duty.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Simon, just curious to have your views from Saxo's viewpoint.
Firstly, I'd echo what Nick said and concur with his thought. What we do is we are recognising putting the importance of good consumer outcomes at the heart of our business every day. Our board, our senior management, all our people have been trained, and we're a UK regulated entity here. But it's really, really important. It comes down to all of our customers, our customer personas, board training, senior manager training, and we try and sort of get it into the everyday sort of mindset of what we're doing. This is a sort of cultural change. It's going to take some time, but this is a really big mind shift change in what we're trying to achieve. So what we have. So it's incredibly important that our sort of everyone speaks about customers in a consistent manner wherever they are in the world. So it may be like a client service person that sort of picks up the phone on our behalf in another jurisdiction. They need to think about it in the same way as someone does in London or in our Danish office. So very, very important that we sort of have the right mindset that features through all our people, all our governance, and right up to the board level.
Thank you for that, Simon. Just probably an additional question to any of you who might like to take that on this tone from the top and the training and the communication here. Would you see the communication as an additional communication or training being rolled out, or would you look at consumer duty training to be a part of the other training, sort of an integral part of other messages like values and conduct?
In my experience, the kind of best practice is, given this is a new piece of legislation, needs to be very focused training, top down and across each of the impacted parties. But it's a continuum, right? Because people need to be aware that this is coming. And it's almost like a continuous sort of awareness campaign. Consumer duty is coming. This is how it impacts you. And lots of forums where people can raise questions and, get their answers and understand how it's going to actually change their day-to-day life. It's not just, I understand the legislation, but this is what I need to do. And I think that's the most impactful way about going about the training.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nick and Simon. The next section, sort of one of the key things that everyone's talking about is the role of tangible MI. So the FCA identified that key MI levers should be used to monitor the ongoing consumer duty compliance. So we're curious to understand how organizations can go about capturing the relevant MI and how can they actually derive value from it. So Nick, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
MI is always a hot topic on a lot of these things, and I think people get very much into sort of the data element. But really, what a lot of people need to be focusing not just on the quantitative side of things, but also on the qualitative side of things. So there's a lot of data points people can capture. Customer complaints, outcomes in terms of products, in terms of profitability, and there's a wide range of them. But people should actually look at the kind of what were the outcomes, what changed. People should think about it very often, almost like they think about operational risk. Lessons learned. There was an incident with a consumer. What did we learn? What did we change in terms of our processes and that feedback loop? In terms of the manufacturers. And I'll talk to that now because they're effectively 2 months away from going live. They need to be thinking, about, certainly in terms of the complex products, stress testing, in terms of value for money. They need to think about the performance of their products against agreed thresholds. But it's not just about these sorts of capturing this sort of data. Is then how do they discuss that data with the distributors? And that handshake is really, really important. And therefore, it's not just their MI. The distributors need to be talking to the manufacturers about their expectations as well.
There's so much interchange or handshake of the MI. And I'm just wondering, Joseph, if you'd like to come in here and explain the role of technology solutions on how we can support firms with the collection and the use of this MI.
From my perspective, I think it's important to acknowledge that the existing approach to data collection and governance in this space hasn't worked, or has at least been inadequate in some way. It's repeatedly called out by the FCA, and it's one of the sort of core tenets underpinning consumer duty. And acknowledging that, I think, is really important. So having an open mind about reporting and assurance going forward and approaches that you can take, I think is really important. Consumer duty has introduced the requirement to demonstrate. I think this is a really, really important concept. So, when you've defined good outcomes, when you've looked at your take-to-market plans, your target markets, and you've got your product governance and definitions set out across your customer journeys, how do you demonstrate that to the regulator and your board that what you actually say you do, you actually do? And for me, this is quite a fundamental shift. So, in this sort of traditional 3 lines of defense model, traditional reporting frameworks, quite manual, quite labor intensive, you'll have to scale up your compliance teams pretty significantly, and you're monitoring reporting teams significantly to meet the requirements unless you change the way that you operate. And so I think technology can play a real role here in introducing machine assessment, a machine line of defense, providing the breadth of analysis through machine assessment, and then triaging and prioritizing into highly skilled human teams to do what Nick just talked about, really take in that, using your expertise, introduce that subjectivity, and really get under the skin of cases that have yielded bad outcomes and take meaningful action on the back of it. But it's that combination of machine assessment and human expertise that I think is going to provide the breadth and the depth required for consumer duty compliance.
I think that is so interesting because, combined with the previous point that we're talking about, such as tone from the top and accountability, the parts you're talking about, whether it's machines or humans or three lines of defense, all those intricacies of how is this one part is defining things and then capturing the information, but then what do you actually do with that information and how do you demonstrate that you did something about it? So in that context, Simon, would you like to share, how can the information actually be used? What will change and what can change?
If we take it back to basics, we've got to deliver good outcomes for retail investors every day. The cross-cutting rules, we need to act in good faith, avoid foreseeable harm, enable customers to pursue their financial objectives. That's what we try and do every day. And we sort of break that down into product, services to be appropriate, price and value, consumer understanding, making sure that consumer really understand what they're getting, and our sort of communication is verbal and written has been done properly, and that we're supporting our retail customers every day. So we need to be accessible 24/7 a day for whatever concerns are raised. So I guess with MI, we can, I think Nick and Joseph have alluded to it, but, we can capture an enormous amount of MI. We can look at complaints, and if it's complaints and thematics, then it's got pretty bad, right? And we've not recognized things. But how many people are looking at our training? Are there any themes? Are there enhancements? Are we surveying our customers? Are we really looking at sort of clients so that if they're losing parts of a part, if they're sort of continually losing money or gaining money, do we speak to them? Do we engage with them, right? It's all about what you say you will do and evidencing what you say you will do, right? Because if it's not evidenceable, it doesn't exist, and you're not really sort of making it real and bringing it into life, right? So we catch a lot of good MI, but it's what do you do differently as a result of that management information, and how is that management information acted on within your organization, and how does it flow through your organization, and what are you doing differently?
That almost brings us to the next section of this, which is about vulnerability, because one of the most interesting aspects of the MI is also how do we capture signs of vulnerability, and how do we pay special attention to consumers who demonstrate characteristics of vulnerability. So, and firms are really unclear about, how far do you go? How far do you go in detecting vulnerability? And what do you actually do with it? And how do you treat a vulnerable consumer differently? So I'm just wondering, Simon, would you like to elaborate on that? Saying how do we define it, and what might be some issues that we encounter in this journey?
I think it's difficult, right? Because a number of we all speak to our customers extremely digitally these days. We may not have. It's not like old private banking. We have a lot of people are very much mobile friendly. We don't always talk to our sort of customers on a day-by-day basis, right? But what we really need to understand is some of the sort of characteristics associated with our sort of customers. So that could be health, it could be lifestyle events, it could be resilience, it could be capabilities or knowledge of what they're trying to do. So we need to really sort of think about where some of these characteristics apply within our business or could apply within our business. And look, we are going to try our very, very best to sort of understand all of the tens of thousands of clients that we have. However, we're not going to get it absolutely right every time, but we're going to sort of demonstrate, be on we are going to do absolutely everything we can to get it as good as it can be. But so we've got to sort of think about, we've got to think about getting it right as much as possible, and we will learn, and it will be evolution, and it will be a continuous improvement. But what we really need to ensure is that the tools are there for our customers, and they access them, and they're clear and they're concise, and you don't need to be, the world's sort of trading expert or investor expert to read them. So they need to be very sort of clearly articulated. And then we need to be available for customers at any point in the cycle. So that might be 24/7 in a day. We need to be contactable, and we need to be very reactive, right? We have to sort of do everything we can to be available to our customers throughout their journey, because everyone has lifestyle events in their lives, and we need to be available for our customers.
I think that's really interesting. And when you mention the point around we need to be able to react to consumers, probably going on to Joseph here, how can we use technology again in this entire scenario? Probably one is to be able to see where consumers actually need help. And as Simon says, be there 24/7. Do firms have a responsibility to go into a more proactive scenario to say, is there something I could have seen before the client told me? And how can technology be used to better recognize and record the responses to be able to derive that conclusion?
As you glean from what Simon said there, I mean, this is hugely complex. There's no silver bullet from a technology perspective. It's a combination of culture, tech, process, clear next best actions when vulnerability is identified. And these things all have to work in harmony to have an effective vulnerable customer framework. One example of where tech can play a really good part, we worked with a national bank. Their challenge was, well over 500,000 interactions a month, relatively large monitoring teams covering less than 1% of those interactions. And they didn't feel confident that across their contact centers, their contact center teams, people had adequate training to deal with the breadth of potential vulnerable customers. So we trained models using tens of thousands of examples to help that identification process. So from every single interaction, an assessment of vulnerability, a prioritization of vulnerability, and then a triage into appropriate teams. That could be supervisors for training, that can be risk and compliance teams for monitoring, but essentially it gives that full picture of how vulnerability is emerging. And if you think about the pandemic and situations like that, these things different themes and trends can emerge over time. The cost of living crisis is a really good example at the moment. But that helps with the identification. That has to work in concert with the right process, with the right next best actions, with the right training, etc.
I think you're absolutely I fully agree. The fact that it's very complicated, and as it's very difficult to tell what is the next lifestyle change an individual will come through, and sometimes we don't ourselves recognize that we're vulnerable. So it's a very sensitive issue, and it's very difficult to manage. So to that point, Nick, I mean, how could you explain to us, where does the role of a firm start and stop? How do you protect your business? How do you protect your consumer? And how far is a firm's duty to go in such as cost of living crisis? How do you determine affordability, or saying the client's probably doing something that is beyond their affordability, and we have a duty to protect clients? So how do you actually, could you help us understand that a bit more?
This is probably the one area of the legislation people have spent most time on, because it's a sensitive subject. And, I can again echo, what Simon and Joseph have been saying about, the mechanisms and the responsibilities. I mean, but people need to come back to, the core of the legislation, which is you just need to take reasonable steps. And you can only go so far if a consumer doesn't want to let you know that they're vulnerable. There's only so much you can do. There's only so much data you can capture on that. So as long as the people, have the mechanisms, the processes, the people are trained in terms of the way they're dealing with people, those reasonable steps are really important, to have them in place and traceable and auditable. But there's also, what do you do with the data when you've got it? and there's a big read across to UK GDPR here as well. And one of the things that people need to really think about is, what can you, how can you use that data in a permissible way? And that, and that's part of, legislation is not in and of itself. You need to do the read across very often to other parts of the legislation to make sure you're comfortable with that. And that's about protecting your consumers, and it's also about protecting yourselves. So they're things to think about. And as I said, overreach is probably as dangerous as underreach on some of this stuff as well. So it's really making sure that you're clear about how and when and you catch data and how you can use it.
I think that's your point here is making me think, and I think this discussion is so worthwhile. And there's been a lot of conversation about financial exclusion as well. Do you think, and I'm just going to throw it to a question to any of you who wants to take this one, but do you think that, taking it too far could be telling individuals or determining, someone's vulnerable? Could there be a risk of financial exclusion for a certain, when, to your point, Joseph, when machine learning and AI takes in and says, here is a possible trait that could determine that a person's vulnerable, could there be a risk of exclusion there?
There could be if this sort of technology is deployed incorrectly, but for the purposes of things like identifying vulnerable customers, the methodology is very much human plus. So there is no follow-on action without the intervention of a human to assess the output. This is about identification, prioritization, triage, and you must notify the customer if you are going to register them as vulnerable to comply with GDPR requirements. So there is definitely scope for misuse of this sort of technology, but it's got to be part of this broader process where you're not relying on any sort of black box to label the customer and enable consequences for that customer on the back of that labeling.
I agree with that, Joseph, very much. There needs to be, like, you can have the tooling and AI that sits in the background, but it's very much a human sort of that needs to look at all the exhibits, and it's not like necessarily a fully rules-based approach. There needs to be interpretation, right? Because it might be like a client has a single name concentration. They might like sort of you need to give them the tools to risk manage, to have those tools, but also you need to sort of have that interaction with them to understand what is in their head and why they're trading what they're trading. So that's really important as well, exactly. Right? And sometimes clients, I might think a client is losing a proportion of their money that is, it feels high, but it might be a tiny proportion of their money, and they may have something in their head. So it's proportionate to the client's own individual circumstances.
Exactly, and some vulnerabilities are transient, some vulnerabilities are permanent. So you've got to be really careful with the labels that you put on people.
Exactly,
and people may be vulnerable and come out of being vulnerable or pre-vulnerable, right?
Thank you so much. I think that's really interesting. Going on to then, taking this from the concept and the design elements and deploying the tooling and all of that. In terms of execution and finally bringing this all to life, I'm just keen to understand what are the key considerations surrounding, what does successful implementation look like? Specifically in the era of today, open banking, embedded finance, partnerships, where there's multiple third-party vendors trying to come together and build out, one full end-to-end journey. How do we see vulnerability, or how do we see consumer duty coming to life and say who's actually accountable for what? So Nick, would you like to spend some time explaining that to us?
Yes, so a couple of things to think about. One is about your execution approach around centralization and decentralization. A lot of firms have decentralized the implementation and allow businesses to sort of run off in at their own rate, which is very effective, actually delivering to a timeline. But one of the issues you have is the design read across, and people forget that consumers can be consumers of different businesses, or customers of different businesses within the same firm. So it's important to have a centralized design authority or team to provide minimum standards. So you still have the flexibility to deliver, but you also have that minimum standard for the firm, which is important. In terms of the handshakes and the handoffs you're referring to, and I've mentioned it earlier, there's and actually the FCA mentioned it in their implementation plan review. The handshake between manufacturers and distributors, I think is still being worked through at the moment, and I think almost deliberately the manufacturer's deadline was put before the distributor's deadline, so that at least you've got a grounding of where the manufacturers are, to allow the distributors to sort of engage with them a bit. But I think that handshake's really, really important. The legislation and the regulators talk a lot about third parties, but very often from a UK legislation perspective, the third party, in a way, could be other people within your own firm. So the making sure that people who supply services to you are very much aware of what the requirements of the legislation are, and they feel a sense of accountability to the delivery of the components is really, really important. And very often, that can be a weak link, where you're using customer service centres on UK based, and other types of utilities. So I think that's an important thing for people to sort of think about. And then in terms of the execution is really only as good as the embedding. So making sure that the embedding part of the plan and making sure that people are doing what you plan to do is as important really as the detail you put in to get yourself to a certain place in terms of your policies, your technology changes, your training, whatever it may be. It's that sustainability is really important.
Great. I think that is that's so critical, and I think it continues to become even more important as we go. And there's multiple providers coming together, manufacturers, distributors in the end-to-end value chain. Joseph, can I ask, what technology inventions or innovations are there to help the industry with the continued demands at lower costs actually, and more demanding clients as well? So how does it all come together, and what can technology do to help?
Yeah, I think we're seeing some really exciting, interesting innovation emerging over recent months. Across the product governance space, across AI automation, natural language processing, there's lots of potential here to automate the hard yards and empower the humans for higher skilled, more meaningful sort of roles. And so I think it's really exciting. One of the big challenges that everyone will be aware of is sort of legacy systems or systems that don't speak to each other. Like creating a harmonized data layer that can essentially make sense of data from across functional areas is going to become essential to help automate case reviews where you're looking at an end-to-end journey. So that data harmonization layer is going to become super important, I think, for people to leverage tech. And one final thing to mention, and it'd be remiss not to mention it, large language models like ChatGPT have now seeped into the consciousness of the general public. And the power and the potential of these large language models is frightening. I mean, they are incredible, but they come with some very big health warnings around domain expertise, lack of reliability. But when the appropriate guardrails and restrictions are placed around these models over coming months and years, these are going to introduce a complete paradigm shift in the way that we can interrogate large data sets and the way that businesses interact with their own data sets and their customers. And it's going to be a really, really exciting space. And I think it's actually really well timed with Consumer Duty and the additional requirements being put on businesses.
I think coming to your point, it's a really really key point that you mentioned. ChatGPT or ever-changing technologies, and even just being able to consume that information, but then make a logical conclusion out of it, or to say here's how we're going to use that in our entire framework. So Simon, would you like to maybe share what is your view on? Do you think compliance teams are well equipped or trained to be able to deal with the changes in consumer duty, but then the impact of ever-changing models and technologies available? And how does it all fit together, and how do you continually upskill the teams to be able to deliver and consume all of this and then deliver the outcome?
a paradigm shift. This is mindset. This is cultural. This is a really, really important change, and actually a very, very important and complementary change for our customers. Compliance teams will need to evolve and think really hard about their capabilities and skill sets in order to be able to, it's almost like when AML and KYC and sort of false positives, all the sort of data mining that we used to get, 10 years ago through sort of that came through. We're going to get so much information and so much data streaming and so much insight for large client populations. What's going to be really important for compliance teams is how they read across, how they get consistency, how they don't spend lots of inefficient time working on things that actually aren't particularly relevant, right? So how they put the layering of the tools across it to actually sort of find what they want from the data and be able to actually make informed boards and senior management teams of real data insight that's meaningful, that's actionable, rather than just catching lots and lots of like really important data and not really knowing what to do with it. So that's an enhancement in capability. We have some great colleagues at Saxo, but I think that's something that we'll definitely be a work on as we evolve through this journey.
Thanks, Simon. And to what you're talking about, how to interpret and use the data. Probably over a question to you, Nick or Joseph, as well as, first of all, how do we know whether we can trust the data and where are the reasonable steps to be taken there? So how accurate is the technology being used? How accurate are these methodologies? Is the AI telling us what we wanted to know? Who's accountable and where does reasonable steps sit in here?
From the perspective of any data-driven technology, accuracy, reliability is super important. For systems operating in this type of space, you would expect to see all output delivered with a confidence level. So if you are classifying a particular part of a conversation, if you're assessing a document versus a conversation, how confident is the system that the classification is correct? And that enables thresholds to be set in terms of accuracy, and I think it's never going to be perfect, or it's very hard to be perfect. But the additional insight and information you can get across populations is incredibly valuable if used correctly, as Simon said. And just to add to Simon's point, if I was the head of compliance or a CRO now looking at these emerging trends in consumer duty and the requirements of a compliance function, I potentially see this as a huge opportunity, to become a bit of a central nervous system for an organization. All of a sudden, you are the central function that's required to consolidate all of this information. Therefore, getting customer feedback, product feedback, competitor feedback, getting all of that information is going to come from essentially where you centralize that data. So, I think it's a real opportunity for compliance functions to move beyond the core purpose of compliance and become real value-add engines within an organization.
I think that will evolve enormously over time as well, right? If we sort of snap the clock in a year or two's time, and you're in a compliance function, it's just like, what are you measuring versus, we're all doing this, independently, obviously speaking to colleagues, just Chatham House rules. But once we've really dip tested this in a year or two's time and see where we get to, I think there'd be an enormous amount of value about how we benchmark against everyone else and what the sort of common findings and themes are throughout this and what works really well and what's not working so well. So I think this will get, it's like all regulation over time, it gets embedded and it's continuous improvement, and we get even better at executing on what we intended as a result of deploying this.
I agree with everything that's been said, and very extremely well made points. I think this is actually a broader topic, though. I think that it's a journey that compliance, as we have increased technology, AI, their skills and how they interpret data and the things they need to do. I think this is a journey, and I think consumer duty really just brings it to a head a little bit. And it's one of those things, again, apologies to go back to execution again, but very often we don't look at the skills and the people that we're being asked to do the job, once the things go live. So I thought it's a great question actually, because it goes to the heart of sometimes some of the challenges of the teams that actually have to implement this thing, beyond that go live date.
Yeah, just on that point, Nick, it was just a reflection really on your point. I think the testing that the program, the design principles, the architecture, I think the points you made earlier are very, very valid. And I think it's the assurance. How do we get assurance that the program outcomes have been achieved consistently in every geography that we are operating to the same standard every day, right? And that's what we really need to aim for. In a previous life, I've done quite a lot of transformation work, and that's really, really important. Can you send auditors all over the world and they can get the same outcome? They can measure things in the same way. It might be in a different language, but they get, people thinking about things in the same way, i.e. customer services or support people in Singapore, in India, in Prague, or wherever they may be in the world, will come up with a consistent approach to incoming traffic from customers. That's pretty important.
We've got a few more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time, and we've got 2 minutes left. So probably what we'll do is, I think the session's been really interactive and really great. Before I conclude, would you like to share any final thoughts, any of you?
I think it's been extremely interactive, and it's been a really good, lively debate. And I think there's a huge amount to be achieved in this space. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
So on that note, we'll call it a wrap, and thank you so much, Nick, Joseph, and Simon for your participation, and also to everyone listening. I can see some really interesting questions, such as how will business models be impacted, and will firms have the courage to make the required changes to business models? But we can probably take that through email, and we'll come back to everyone. So look out for a newsletter with a little more information from Delta Capita, Saxo, and Aveni. And on that note, I wish you all a very good day or evening, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.